Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to Conversations in the Digital Age. President Obama passed on the Paris Unity March, and the White House was quick to admit that it had made an error. This led Council on Foreign Relations President Emeritus Les Gelb to call for the resignation or the dismissal of the entire national security apparatus on the ground that they had fouled up. Was this enough to convince us that America has lost its grip on foreign policy? With us to discuss this issue is an expert in the field. He is Jim Hoge. Jim Hoge is the editor emeritus of Foreign Affairs magazine and a veteran journalist. Jim, we're delighted to have you back with us.
Glad to be here.
Now, first, do you agree with Les Gelb, whom we all respect, admire, and love, that they all should be dismissed because of this foul-up over Obama's attending the Paris Unity March?
Well, Les is very good at making a point and making sure other people hear it. And I take it that that's what he was really up to. And it certainly does register. We're talking about it today, and I'm sure it's going to be elsewhere. However, as a practical matter, getting rid of everybody involved at the top of national security with a year and a half left of a presidency is not realistic.
He argues that going there was real. It should have been a no-brainer for the president and a no-brainer for his staff. And if they're not up to that one, how are they going to be up to the tough decisions?
Well, you can make that linkage. I do think both at the White House level and at the staff level and the embassy level, we dropped the ball. And I must say they were very quick to admit that and to sort of say, all right, you got us, let's move on. Now, moving on means keeping the very close contacts we have with the French on intelligence and counter-espionage, counterintelligence, robust and going forward. I must say the French have been courteous in their response to our not showing up in Paris when we should have. They're being very low-keyed about it. And my guess is this is an incident that will pass pretty quickly, and we go on to more serious things, such as what is really going on with terrorism and what, if anything, we can do about it.
Well, it might have passed quickly, except a week after the march, Secretary of State Kerry finally showed up in Paris. Yeah. And with whom did he show up? None other than James Taylor. Right. And he had James Taylor sing at some sort of reception for the French, "You've Got a Friend." Now, Jim, do you think this was the kind of robust diplomacy we need in a troubled world such as ours?
Jim, I'm a great fan of the singer, James Taylor.
Oh, he's terrific.
And I think his music has been put to better use than this time around. I think it was nice of him to go ahead and front for an embarrassment to the United States. I'm sure he's will be recompensed in some way. But let's move on now to what the serious problems that have to be dealt with.
Well, an issue that might have given the White House pause was that this French magazine, Charlie Hebdo, had apparently insulted Islam along with other religions. And so they didn't want to appear, I suppose, too sympathetic to Charlie Hebdo. Now, do you think that this was the proper approach?
This is an awkward situation because on the level of principle and what we stand for and what the French stand for, you've got to be very careful about too easily going to forms of censorship. Now, the Pope has suggested that, has said that we should not be impugning other people's spiritual values, their religion that they espouse to, and so on. But even he didn't say the way to do that is to practice censorship. So it comes down to, is there some way to get society to behave itself without tripping over the lines of controlling speech and assembly.
The criticism of that is, of course, that we'll allow the radicals to define the area of insult. If they say something's insulting to them, so therefore they have a right to murder 12 people, they'll go ahead and do it, and it shouldn't be given as an excuse. And we experienced this before in Benghazi.
Well, let me be clear. Maybe I wasn't before. I don't favor censoring in a situation like this. I think, however, if they want to say it, we have every right to say you shouldn't have. That this was just provocative and braggadocio and really lowball, so to speak. But if they're going to do it, they have a right to, and I think we want to preserve that right.
The White House has been wary of using the phrase Islamist terrorism or radical Islamist terrorism when it comes to the description of terrorist acts. And so I wondered what your thought was. I mean, is this a right way to go? I mean, the face of terrorism right now has been Islamic.
Well, look, this is in a long line of statements. After 9/11, for example, George Bush said, let's not blame all of Islam. Let's not blame every Muslim. This is a splinter group following a form of Islam which is aberrant. I think this is just the same, and I don't think there's anything we can do about it, except live with it.
But Bush did say it was a clash of civilizations, and maybe he was criticized for that.
He was quoting an article that actually we ran in Foreign Affairs by a great political scientist, Samuel Huntington, which essentially said that we're moving into an era in which the great conflicts will be between civilizations as a whole, i.e. Christianity versus Islam, rather than just what monarchs want or what egregious states want. And that has proven out to some extent. There's no question about it.
I think after the Paris attacks, Egyptian President Sisi, who of course is a Muslim, made this statement. He said, quote, "We are in need of religious revolution. You imams are responsible for Allah. The entire world is waiting for your next move because the Islamic world is being torn, it is being destroyed, it is being lost, and it is being lost by our own hands." Why can't the President of the United States take a similar line?
Well, he's had plenty to say. I think one of the interesting things that the Sisi comment gets to in its own way, and others have done, I think, more effectively, is that from within the Islamic world, there have to be leadership voices that are stronger and clearer and more adamant than we have seen today. The two great religions in terms of numbers are Christianity, which is well over 1 billion, and Islam, which is also over 1 billion. And when things like this happen, you need to have a course set at the top. And if it isn't set at the top, then everything feels like they can sort of make up their own view of history and of right and wrong.
Madeleine Albright defined foreign policy, at least American foreign policy, as trying to make other nations do what we want them to do. And we...
without coercion.
Without coercion, and through soft power, through persuasion.
Power. Yeah.
And we live in a world where we see a lot of nations and a lot of actors not doing what we want them to do. And the question is, what's to be done about it? So let's go around the world and talk about various trouble spots that we see and find out whether we're doing enough and whether Gelb is right, that maybe we're losing our grip as world leaders. Let's start with ISIS. We were kind of late diagnosing the threat of ISIS, weren't we?
We were, so was everybody else. This was one that came out of nowhere, so to speak. The take on ISIS that I think is probably closest to the reality, if we can get that before the event, is that it is running out its string, that it is a phenomenon that it will be losing power rather than gaining more power. The way they behave, what they do to their fellow Muslims, for example, is just not acceptable in most places. And you can see public opinion in the Islamic world as well as elsewhere turning against them. Now, just alone, that probably won't curb the events, but it certainly is the right path to start going down. In terms of dealing with ISIS, I think we have to be very patient, and we have to be very collegial, if you will, in getting others to help address this problem, and particularly from in the Muslim world.
Of course, the danger of ISIS is really not that they're going to take a great deal of territory. They don't have the numbers, but they've branded themselves and can spread to other parts of the Islamic world, particularly to North Africa. So what do we do about that?
Well, two thoughts on that. One is that these kind of terrorist phenomena tend to start and then to stop some time in history without ever knowing exactly why. It can be a number of different factors. The second thought I have is that bad as this is, and it's a tragedy for the people involved, these are not national security threats to us, nor are these threats to turn the world upside down, a world war, for example. It's much lower than that. And if you go to the higher level, the picture of the world at the moment is a hell of a lot more stable than it has been in most periods. And there are no indications of any of the great states, which don't agree on a lot, thinking that a military campaign would be in their own interest. So while we have some military budgets, for example, going up, the Chinese one is year in, year out, it's not excessive. It's what one would expect from a country of that size that's growing the way it is. So on the whole, I think this is a very chaotic world and will be for quite some time. This is not going to go away anytime soon. On various kinds of divisions, religious, economic, geographic, you name it. But they so far do not, they are not producing threats of the size that we have to be concerned about in terms of our own security, our own prosperity.
Well, you take a country like Nigeria. Now, of course, there in northern Nigeria, it's Muslim, and in the southern part of the country, it's Christian. But in the northern part, you have Boko Haram, a terrorist group, not identified as being part of ISIS, but certainly acting similar to ISIS, and they're killing thousands of people and leveling cities. And I mean, isn't this amounting to something of a terrorist threat, or isn't it approaching a terrorist threat?
Well, it certainly is a terrorist threat there. And by the way, Nigeria is the largest country in Africa and the biggest GNP now. So this is not an inconsequential little event that's going on. Boko Haram is so over the top in terms of destroying people's lives, their villages, and so on. I don't see how it can last at that level. However, what to do to respond to it? We can play a supporting role, sending in equipment, whatnot else, training troops, and so on. But it's going to have to be the Nigerian government, and it's going to have to be, if it's going to be internationalized, it's going to have to be the African Union itself. There is no national security reason of ours that we should be getting involved. And then I think we ought to point this out, Jim. The recent track record of American intervention to try and control combats has been a terrible one. More than anything else, we have added to the zeal of those who want to take us on, who want to put bombs on the road and so forth and so on. It was in Bosnia that way, it has been in Iraq that way, it's that way in Afghanistan, and it would be that way in Syria if we were to go in. If we were to go into Nigeria, believe me, I think the same thing.
So let's move on to Russia, which may be more of a threat. Do you see Russia as making more of a move on Ukraine or possibly Moldova in the coming year?
The ironic thing about Russia is that from the point of view of American policy is what the first big statement that Obama made when he came to office was it's time for a reset with Russia. We have lots in common. What we don't have in common, we can negotiate about. We should be moving into a more Pacific era, so to speak. Has not turned out that way at all. And I don't think we can really understand what Putin is up to, because it's such a closed society and he is such a closed leader. But it would appear that he is trying to create, not to recreate the Soviet Union, that can't be done, but he's trying to recreate an assemblage of power in the Central Eurasian area, with Russia at the head of it, to be a major player versus the European Union, versus the Northern Hemisphere, us versus China, and what's going on in Asia.
But it's quite similar to the aspiration of Russia historically from the time of the Tsars to be expansionist.
Yes, it is. It is. The reasons have changed somewhat, but it is pretty much the same. And I think it's not going to work for the long term. However, as far as we are concerned, I think we've got to be very patient as well as firm. And we have to continue to build up alternates to what Putin would like as a world order. For example, we can't let Europe continue to deteriorate. We've got to start helping, find ways to help more than we have. I would say particularly Central Europe, which is at the moment on the edge of some real economic growth that would be very important and would be a sort of a hedge against Russia. But I think Putin is somebody we should be very careful about, because he's kind of unknowable, but don't exaggerate his potential influence, which I don't think is going to be that great over time.
Europe appears to be destabilizing rather rapidly. The Swiss decided to depeg the Swiss franc to the euro, creating tremendous economic problems in Europe. We see the rise of nationalism and anti-Semitism in Europe, and the response has been to crack down on free speech and to round up the usual suspects, and we see a rise in Jewish immigration from France, anyway, to Israel. Is Europe imploding?
I don't think it's imploding, but it certainly is fraying and spreading out. And one reason for that, I think, is that the European Union, not official, but the Union of European States, only occurred because of the great threat from Soviet Russia, which was an expansive power of the first order. With that threat gone, what is to keep all these nations together, which are the fully mature societies, fully mature governments with overlapping but also distinct interests of their own? So I think some of what we're seeing is the natural outcome of having won the Cold War.
And but we thought the natural outcome was to give economic aid to Europe, put it back on its feet, and then let it become an important ally.
Well, the first part of that occurred.
Yeah.
The second part is a story still in the making. I would say this, however, that all of Europe together is an extremely important ally to the United States. Economically, it puts us in the same league. If you can hook those two up, North America, then across the Atlantic, Europe, in what's happening with China and the Far East. So we cannot just throw our hands up and walk away because the Europeans are not behaving, so to speak. We've got to find ways to continue strengthening the partnership between us and those major countries, France, Germany, so
well,
forth.
Strengthen the partnership, but Obama announced he wanted to pivot toward Asia, which implies turning your back on one interest, and it's kind of a basketball term, and finding another interest. But has the pivot been successful?
No, and because there was no pivot, he's been back off of that. He recognizes the word doesn't mean exactly what he was trying to get across, which was what I think he was saying, if I read between the lines correctly. We hadn't been paying as much attention to Asia because of the crises, multiple crises in the Middle East, and because of slippages in Europe, and that we had to refocus on Asia because that, frankly, is where the great issues of economics in this world and of security are going to flower the most. And I think he was trying to say we're going to refocus on Asia and on our role in Asia. Now, that's not pivoting, because pivoting is you're giving up something to take on something else, and I don't think he meant that.
But what's
I hope he didn't.
Well, the dominant figure in Asia is undoubtedly China,
Right.
at least from our perspective. What's happened with China? The 2 years Xi has been in there, there have been increased human rights violations, increased crackdowns on dissidents, increased censorship, increased corruption, prosecutions against political rivals. I mean, where are we headed with China?
Well, first of all, I don't think we have a China strategy that you can define and put your finger on, and I think that's too bad. But on an ad hoc basis, I think we've done reasonably well in making some opportunities available to them, constricting them in some ways, keeping any fires from developing in a major way. Now, having said that, it's getting more and more tough to do that because under Xi Jinping, China has become more repressive with each passing year. And the trouble with repression of the size that he's got now, freedom of speech is out, freedom of assembly is out, and so forth, is that one round of repression leads to further outrages, which leads to another round of repression. It just gets worse. So I think we're in for a tough time in terms of a cooperative relationship beyond some very basic fundamentals. Neither one of us wants to go to war. We don't want a nuclear challenge and so forth and so on. But on a more practical basis of what trade agreements will be, what the limits of sovereignty are and so on, I think it's going to be a tough period.
Tough for the other countries in Asia because with an economic slowdown that we're seeing in China, the other Asian countries that are important, and even South American countries like Brazil, important trading partners of China, are going to find they can't export their goods.
In a certain sense, you can say this is one of the very few sort of favorable things of the current situation with China, which is Southeast Asia, which for a while was harping at us for not paying attention, not being involved, and maybe not being useful anymore. And therefore, they were all making one kind of deal or another, or going into negotiations with China. They've all now been scared. They've been scared over China's exertions of the last 2 years to extend their hegemony, if you will, over the China Seas, both South China and East China, and beyond that. So they've all come calling to us again. Hi, we missed you. And we are following up, as I understand it, pretty well in making new agreements, both for security purposes and for economic purposes with the Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, so forth.
Now, quickly, Iran, we've kicked the can down the road until May. Suppose we don't come up with a nuclear deal by May. What's going to happen?
Well, the outside date, we're supposed to have the outlines of what our deal would be in March. And then the outside date, I believe, is July, which to everybody means May. If you don't have something by May, you're probably out of the game. I don't know anybody that can call this one. This, I think we can say, both sides have now shown that they really would like to have a settlement, that the absence of a settlement is very dangerous. What will Israel do if there's no settlement on nuclear weapons? What will the other countries in the region do, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and so on? Will they feel the need then to arm themselves in a nuclear way? So it's a very big deal, I think. But I can't tell you what's going to happen. I know this, that they've made a lot of progress. But on one or two big issues, like what the centrifuges, how many there will be, what they'll be used for, the gap is still very, very large.
And the rest of the Middle East, any hope for a Palestinian-Israeli peace deal?
Maybe in our lifetime, but probably not.
Probably not. So I have a question for you.
Yes.
Is the United States losing its grip on world leadership?
Is the United States losing its grip? No, but it's, let's put it this way. It needs to dry its palms off because they've gotten a little greasy, I think, and we're slipping. But if you take a look at the indices of power, which are behind diplomacy and world events, we are moving into an era in which the United States has not a less, but a wider gap in terms of capabilities, economic, politically, geopolitically. And it's not for a couple of reasons that will disappear. This is long term. In fact, most of the economists who do global risk assessments that I know of think that we're looking at a 10 to 20 year period of American predominance, if you will. Now, other countries are growing, and they're one a day in the sun more than in the past. But the idea that the United States is in decline is perfectly ridiculous. And
we're not in decline.
We're not.
Unfortunately, we have to stop.
And here we are.
And here we are. We're not in decline. So, Jim Hoge, thank you so much for coming by. This has been just marvelous. And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations in the digital age. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best. Take care.